if you can't connect with someone or get a question answered within this meeting, please feel free to reach out to me afterward and I'll help you. So let's get started with some project information and updates. And let's begin with, I think, Molly, help me pronounce your last name correctly. It's Molly Mazel, right?
Mazel, yeah.
Mazel, thank you.
Say it many different ways and I won't blink an eye. All right, so I'm Molly Mazel. I gave a brief update at last month's meeting, but basically I am local food distribution development coordinator at Mountain Roots Food Project in Gunnison, Colorado. We are also managing an 18-month USDA planning grant. It's a local food promotion planning grant. So we're working on identifying barriers to increasing supply and demand of food produced in our region, and then we're going to test pilot some of the strategies that we heard through that research this upcoming season with our Tier 1 or primary partner, the San Luis Valley Local Foods Coalition. So where we're at with that process, we've kind of finished our Tier 1 Gunnison and San Luis Valley roundtable and surveying with our stakeholders, which are producers and consumers on both the wholesale and individual level. And we have a report coming out really soon by the end of this month with all the results of the research we conducted. And then our proposed pilot programs that will be starting this coming growing season. But in a nutshell, those are kind of in 4 buckets to give you kind of a sneak peek preview. So we did through that research level, we had affirmed what we thought that, the aggregated sales and distribution, so strengthened local food hubs and the connectivity of those food hubs is really critical to increasing supply and demand of local product and streamlining those relationships. So here in Gunnison, we don't have much of a food hub established. So that's a big piece of this. We're working on Mountain Roots kind of establishing more of an aggregation facility for sales and distribution for all our valley, because that's really a need here. We'll also be working on connecting the lines of distribution, so getting schedules, logistics, routes in place to exchange product between the Gunnison Valley and the San Luis Valley, which will also be new. We don't have that connection right now. And frankly, no products from Gunnison Valley are much getting out of Gunnison Valley. So that's going to be big for our producers. We're going to focus on a few indicator crops. So from the surveying, we kind of matched up crops that producers are willing to scale up production of and wholesale buyers are already purchasing regularly. So we identified 6, which are garlic, carrots, greens, berries, cabbage, and chicken. So we're going to do all or most of those as like the primary focus crops for pushing sales this coming growing season to test out these strategies. Third one, we're going to try what we're going to call a green plate special, which is maybe a concept you've heard of. So we're going to work with local restaurants to offer a green plate special, and we're going to have a marketing campaign around this, and that special at each of those restaurants will be highlighting local food from our Gunnison and San Luis Valleys, but throughout the region as well. And then a marketing and education campaign just around the importance of local foods and these new where and how to get local food. So that's what's coming for our pilot program. And like I said, we have a report coming out really soon with those survey results. So I'll be happy to share it with Sean and the crew here.
Thanks a lot, Molly. That was a great update, and look forward to seeing that report, and we'll be sure to share that out with folks. I also had planned to have Catherine Bedell give an update, but I'm not sure that she's on. Can anybody confirm that she is or not? It doesn't appear to me she is. So let me just give a brief update about our IQF project. Again, an IQF stands for Individual Quick Freeze. CSU has received a grant from the Economic Development Administration, a federal grant that they partnered with 3 different parts of the state on. And one of their partnerships was with Delta County on doing a phase 2 feasibility study of a preservation facility. So that could be dehydration or individual quick freeze, which both are of interest to producers in the region. So right now we're working on kind of the official scope of work and budget for that, just exactly how we'll implement that over the next couple of months. But that's really encouraging. We can take next steps forward in trying to develop that preservation facility. I wanted to let you know too from our talk from last week with Reza and Nan about pulse crops and the benefits of pulse crops to the Western Slope, that the conversation is continuing. We're looking at strategies of how we can get more producers to produce pulse crops enough of a scale, at enough of a scale that we can actually develop the infrastructure for processing those pulse crops. It's sort of a chicken and egg conundrum there. People don't want to produce it unless there's facilities to process it. Processing facilities can't be built unless there's enough people producing it. So we're talking about that. It looks like a worthwhile thing to develop. So that's it for project updates. And if we get any more between now and the time that I send out a newsletter, I'll go ahead and include those in the newsletter. But for now, let's go on into our special presentation with Christy Dice from CSU. Yeah, go ahead, Christy. I'll give you the screen.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm always excited to talk to farmers about the produce safety rule, even though they may not be happy to hear about it. So my name is Christy Dice. I work for CSU Extension. I'm the produce safety specialist. And so I'm based out of Fort Collins, but I do cover the whole state. And so any questions you have about produce safety or about the rule or food safety practices in relation to your produce, I'm your person for that. So today, I'm going to roll through information pretty fast, but my goal is to really give you guys an overview of the produce safety rule. I'm going to talk about, who's covered and who's exempt and what those things mean. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some resources and educational opportunities that are available for you guys. So the produce safety rule, some of this may be a reminder for you guys, but it's important to kind of lay this groundwork. So when we talk about the exemptions, that it's very clear. So the produce safety rule is one of the 7 rules under the Food Safety Modernization Act that was signed into law in 2011 by President Obama. And so it really focuses on those raw agricultural commodities. And so sometimes they're called RACs. We don't look at, any processed produce under this or anything like that. It's mainly that raw, fresh produce. And then the other thing to remember is that the produce safety rule is focused on the microbial contamination of produce and how to prevent that and ways to mitigate those risks. We don't look at any physical or chemical contamination. Those are covered under other rules and regulations. And so FDA didn't want to double regulate people. So that's why we only look at the microbial contamination. And then again, the goal really is to focus on preventing foodborne illness. So in the past, we'd have a foodborne illness outbreak and then there'd be like a reaction to that and try and figure out what happened. And so this rule is really focused on trying to prevent it from your produce from even becoming contaminated. And then we'll talk a bit about, again, those exemptions and exclusions from the produce safety rule. So we're going to get right into it here. So who is covered by the produce safety rule? So farms that grow, harvest, pack, or hold covered produce. So I'll go into detail on each one of these things in subsequent slides, but these are the basics. The second requirement or caveat is that farms have to sell more than $25,000 in fresh produce sales. And so that's on a 3-year rolling average. And so that's important to keep in mind when you're thinking about any monetary values in relation to the produce safety rule. It's always on this 3-year rolling average. So you take your last 3 years of produce sales, you average those together, and then that's your total produce sales for that year, for the year that you're in. And so, if you are a new farmer and you are just starting out and you haven't had, or you're a farmer where you haven't had any sales, you would use a 0 for those years, but that would still be counted into that average. And then the other thing to remember is that $25,000 is adjusted for inflation. And so I'll tell you what that new figure is on another slide. So that's the second requirement, I guess. And then the third thing is that farms that grow produce that's not rarely consumed raw. And so I'll talk more about that in a minute. But again, it's really focused on those fresh produce commodities. So what produce is covered under the rule? And so when I say covered, I mean you have to comply with the rule. When I first started, I heard covered and I thought it meant that it was only produce in a greenhouse or something like that. But it's actually you have to comply with the rule. So again, we're really focused on this, raw agricultural commodities, or RAC. So that's the produce that's covered under the rule. So what is covered produce? So we define covered produce as all produce except the commodities that FDA has identified as rarely consumed raw. And so you can see there's a list there of about 34, 35 things, depending on how you count them, that FDA identified that consumers or people generally cook before they eat it. And so they did this study over 10 years, and they asked people, how do you eat these things? How do you eat produce? And the things that people said they generally cook is what made it onto this list. There are some weird things on there, like asparagus or beets or some herbs. I mean, I eat all those things raw, but for whatever reason, people reported that they don't. And so that's what made it onto this list. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that the FDA just a couple of months ago had this part of the rule open, and we're taking suggestions for commodities that may be added to this list. And so we anticipate in the next coming months, we'll see some changes of products added to this list. We don't anticipate that they were going to take anything off of the list, but they may add some things to the list. And then the other thing to remember with the produce safety rule is that when we're talking about the produce, we're always talking about that harvestable or harvested portion of the crop. So that piece that people are going to be eating is what we focus on. And so that's just important to remember as we think about the standards under the rule and the requirements of the rule. So then what's not covered under the rule? So any food grains, so that would include your dent or flint corn, sorghum, oats, rice, rye wheat, amaranth, quinoa, buckwheat, and oil seeds. So any of those commodities are not considered produce, because again, people are cooking them before they are consuming them, so the risks are lower. Any produce that goes through a kill step, so produce that would be heated to a temperature for a period of time, or produce that goes through some process where it's scientifically documented that pathogens are reduced or eliminated in that product. And I'll talk more about that with one of the exemptions in a few slides. And then the third thing that's not covered is any produce that you grow on your farm for your own consumption. So, some of our farmers have a separate garden just for their family, and, so that would not be covered under the rule. It's only that produce that's being sold out into commerce. So as a review, the farms that are covered are those farms who grow or harvest covered produce. And so packing and holding is also included in that, but the way the rule is written right now, if you don't grow or harvest, you're not considered a farm under the produce safety rule. If you only pack or hold, again, you're not considered a farm, so you're not covered under this part of the rule. I will say the caveat to that is that FDA is reviewing this and trying to figure out how this part of the rule is going to work, but the way it's written right now, these are the requirements. That's the first part. And so again, covered produce is anything that's not on that rarely consumed raw list. And then the second part is if you have your produce sales are over $28,075. So that's that $25,000, but it's adjusted for inflation. So if you meet both of these requirements, it's important to understand that you are considered covered by the produce safety rule. You may be eligible for some partial exemptions, but you are considered covered by the rule. So what are these partial exemptions? There's two options. We have the modified exemption, which is based on your total food sales and your customer base. And then we have this commercial processing exemption. I'm going to talk in more detail about both of these coming up here. So for the modified exemption, the requirements to be eligible for this are that you have to have food sales of less than $561,494 in food sales. So it's important to remember that this is food sales and not just produce. So the $25,000, that was produce, but now we're looking at these food sales. And so you're going to need to account for any food that you sell off your farm. So meat, milk, if you sell animal feed, that's now considered food. And so, so any hay, grain that you sell, that's all factored into that food sales. So anything that something is going to eat is considered the food. So that's the first part. So you have to have less than that. And that number is adjusted for inflation. In the past, you may have seen that it was 500,000, but this is the adjusted for inflation value that we're using right now. And then the second part of it is that over 50% of your sales have to be to qualified end users. And so a qualified end user is the consumer of the food. So that would be if you sell at a farmer's market or a farm stand, anything where you're handing the produce off to the person who's going to eat it. Also included in the qualified end user are restaurants and retail food establishments and grocery stores. So, that is also a part of that qualified end user category. So that's the first part of the qualified end user.
Sorry, Christy, question real quick. Is that 561,494?
Mhm.
Wish they would round that off. Is that an average for 3 years or is
Yep,
that?
so that's that 3-year rolling average. So we take the FDA, like the number FDA puts out what that adjusted for inflation numbers are, and they average them together, and then that's our base. So farmers would do the same thing. So take your last 3 years of food sales, average them together, and see if you're above or below that number. Thank you for clarifying that.
And just one more question. So just to recap again, the previous figure of $28,075, that was just for covered produce, right? That's the
No.
3-year average of just covered? Okay.
No. So thank you for that question as well. Yeah, so it is total produce sales. So if you sell $20,000 in potatoes, which aren't covered, but you sell $8,075 in cucumbers that are covered, you are considered covered under the rule. If when you have an inspection, or if you think about your produce, the only produce we would be looking at for food safety practices would be the cucumbers, but you would be considered covered under the rule. So that 25,000 or that 2875 is the total produce sales, and then this is total food sales. So thank you for clarifying that. Okay, so the second part of the qualified end user is that the customer has to be within the state, so within Colorado or within 275 miles of your farm. And so if you are, on the West Slope, maybe you're selling into Utah, and that's fine as long as it's within 275 miles of your farm. There's two parts to that qualified end user. Again, who it is and where they're located. So you have to meet both of those requirements fully in order to be eligible for this rule. You can't just say, well, I meet the first one, but I don't meet the second one. So you have to meet both of those in order to be eligible for this modified exemption. So what do you have to do? So if you are eligible for this exemption, there's two things you need to do. You need to keep records, and the records that you need to keep are records that support that you meet that qualification. And so you have to keep your sales and your customer base records, and you need to keep those for 3 years. Again, because we're building that 3-year rolling average, you have to keep records supporting that for 3 years. So every year you would update that. You drop off the last year and add in, your most recent year to that to keep that 3-year rolling average going. And then the second part is that you have to document that you are reviewing your records annually, and that you're going through and making sure that you still meet those requirements for that modified exemption. That's the first part. The second part you need to do is around labeling. And so products that require a label, you have to include your complete business name and farm address. And then for those things that you're selling that don't have a label, you need to provide your contact information in a place where it's visible to people where they can see it. And so I'll go through an example now and talk about what that can look like for farmers. So on the slide here, you can see, it may be very small, I apologize, but you can see we have a template available to help you figure out and keep track of, if you're eligible for this modified exemption. It has your total food sales, it has your qualified end users, your non-qualified end users, and it helps you calculate whether or not you're eligible for this. And then at the bottom, there is a place for somebody to sign and date. So so an example of for a farm stand or for farmers markets, if you are one of those, the record keeping that you would need to have would be this template that you've modified for your operation. And then you can keep documentation or receipts of your total food sales for each sales day or sales period. So you'd want to keep that information together along with this record that shows that you are meeting these requirements. It's important to remember you don't have to have individual sales receipts to your specific customers. So if you say, I went to the Montrose Farmers Market and I sold $300 worth of produce at the farmers market, you would just need to have that information. You wouldn't have to have a receipt for each person that you're selling to. So it's again, just keeping track of that you are meeting these requirements. Then the second part is that labeling. So at a farm stand, a lot of your products probably aren't labeled, if you have any that are even labeled. And so, the way that you can display your information to your customers is to just put a sign in the back of your farm stand with your farm name and your address. And so that way people know who to contact or how to get in touch with you in case there's some kind of issue. If you have a receipt, you can put on receipts. Some people use stickers. It just, whatever works best for you, you figure out, or business cards, you can figure out what works for you, but you just have to have that information available. So that would be an example of how a farm stand would need to, comply with this modified exemption. So I hope that helps clarify some things for folks. And I can send out that template. I can send it to Sean and he can send it out to you guys afterwards. And you can always contact me and I can help you as well. So that's the modified exemption. So that's the main, exemption or partial exemption that we see farmers in Colorado. Most of our farms in Colorado have that modified exemption. We probably only have about 60 farms that will actually get an inspection. The rest of them are all either under that exemption, so completely exempt from the rule under that 25,000, or they are they have this modified exemption. So I just like to tell farmers that too. So anyway, so now we're going to talk about this commercial processing exemption. So this only applies to any produce that goes through that kill step, it goes through some kind of further processing where, again, it's heated to some kind of temperature for a period of time, or it goes through some kind of pathogen reduction step. And so, if you're making jams or jellies, any sauces, beer making, wine making, those kind of things fall into this commercial exemption category. It's important to remember that dehydration is not considered a kill step, and that's because you're simply removing the water from that product. You're not heating it to a temperature that might kill any potential pathogens that are on that produce. And then the other thing to remember is that if you have both produce that's going to commercial processing, so if you grow peaches and a portion of them go into peach jam, those would be separate from any fresh produce and fresh peaches that you're selling. So your fresh peaches would still be, need to be complying with the rule. You'd still have to follow, any requirements related to those. But your commercial, the ones that are going into the jam, those would be under this particular exemption.
Okay, Christy, sorry, I have a question there before it goes too far and I forget. But say we did get an IQF up and running, and in the processing of peaches, for example, was a blanching step, which I guess would be a kill step. That would constitute a kill step, wouldn't it? To blanch.
It depends on how long you're doing it and how,
Okay.
how long it's and what temperature it's at. So, you would want to look for some information on, and I could help you find that, but we would want to identify the information, like where do you have to have it for what period of time, in order to kill that.
Say we pass that threshold though in the blanching, and an orchard has sold all of their produce to such a facility.
Yep.
And their produce would be exempt.
Correct. Yep.
If all going to the,
yep.
Okay.
If they're not selling any fresh produce at all, that would apply to this commercial processing exemption. Which is
unrealistic, but nonetheless.
Right. Well, maybe, you never know. So if you if you meet those requirements for the commercial processing exemption, there's a couple of things you have to do. So at the point of sale, you have to provide to whoever's buying your produce or your processor a specific statement, and it needs to be included in whatever documentation goes along with the produce. So bill of lading, receipt, whatever it is, this statement needs to be on there, and it's very specific. The statement needs to be not processed to adequately reduce the presence of microorganisms of public health significance. And so that's saying that this produce is comply with the produce safety rule, and it's okay because it's destined for this commercial processing where any potential pathogens that might be on it have been, eliminated. So that's the first part. And then the second part is you have to get documentation from your processor that shows whatever the kill step is that they're doing. So what are they doing to that produce that is, removing those pathogens? You will see that there are two little red asterisks there. So FDA, this part of the rule is under review and it's not being enforced at this time because when they put this out, they realized that it was more complicated than they had anticipated, and that, getting that information from processors, we needed to know what do you have to get from processors. And so we anticipate at some point we're going to get that information from FDA, but right now we haven't gotten anything. And so that part is under review. So right now, all you have to do is that first bullet point where you're, providing that statement to your processor. it can be a good time to have that conversation with your processor. You know, we're going to need this at some point, you know, documentation of what you're doing. So you can start to have those conversations, but it's not required. So in summary, farms have to comply with the rule if they grow, harvest, pack, or hold covered produce. So again, anything that's not on that rarely consumed raw list. If they have a total produce sales of over $28,075 and they sell produce that's consumed raw. So those are the three things, you know, for you to figure out if you're covered under the rule. But you could, again, you could be eligible for this partial exemption of the modified exemption, which is those food sales less than 561, 494. And that you sell the majority, so over 50% directly to the consumer, or that commercial processing. So those are kind of the summaries of the exemptions. So if you're not eligible for an exemption, what do you have to do? So I wanted to just cover this quick because, you know, I think there's a lot of confusion out there that the produce safety rule is very onerous and impossible for farmers to be able to implement on their farm. And so it does require extra work, but it's not as onerous as maybe farmers feel like it is. So what do you have to have? You have to have food safety practices for, you know, your worker health and hygiene training. So training your employees on food safety practices, how you're handling animals and wildlife on your farm and preventing them from contaminating your produce, how you're handling your equipment, tools, and buildings, again, to prevent them from becoming contaminated so you're not contaminating your produce, your post-harvest handling and sanitation practices. If you're using any soil amendments that contain animal products, you'll need to have food safety practices around handling them. And then finally, agricultural water. And many of you probably know or remember that that part of the rule is under review right now. We do anticipate that at some point this year, FDA is going to give us what those standards are. It'll go through the normal rulemaking process. They'll put it out. There'll be a time for comments. You can read it, put comments in, you know, however you feel like that's going to impact you. And then FDA will issue us those final standards. And, you know, at CSU, once we get these, we're going to do a ton of outreach for you guys, really help you understand what these new standards are. But for right now, that part of the rule is completely not being enforced at all. So you have to have food safety practices, not a food safety plan, not for the produce safety rule, but you have to have practices. So then the second thing is you would need to attend this Produce Safety Alliance grower training. Those are those full day trainings that we do. Well, they're 2 half days virtual now, but normally they were in person and a full day training. It's a one-time training, so if you've already attended, you don't have to attend again. Some farmers like to, they feel like it's a good refresher for them, but you certainly don't have to. Again, it's one-time training. And then you need to maintain records. So you need to have records of that health and hygiene training that you do for your employees. You need to have your records of the food contact surfaces that you're cleaning and sanitizing. And then if you're doing any on-farm composting where you're using animal products to compost as part of your compost, you'll need to keep records around those. And then the fourth thing you need to do is you need to register your farm with the Colorado Department of Agriculture. So this is unique to Colorado. This is not part of the produce safety rules. So if you go into your little rule book, you won't see this, but they did, CDA, the Colorado Department of Agriculture did adopt the produce safety rule into state statutes. And as part of that, farms that sell over that $28,075 need to register with them. Even if you qualify for an exemption, you still have to register with them. It's a no fee registration, no penalty registration. They just, they're trying to create a list of the farms that are in Colorado, and they're required to do that by FDA. So I think you guys got this fact sheet. If not, we can send it out to you. And so I put this together just to try and help farmers understand all this terminology that gets thrown at them as far as like what they need to do on their farms. And so on the top, we have good agricultural practices, and those are really those basic food safety practices that all farmers should implement on their farm to reduce the risks associated with growing produce, because we don't grow in a sterile environment. So those are those basic practices. Then we have the produce safety rule, and so that's separate. That's, you know, the federal law that I just described, you know, and so farmers that have to comply with that rule, you know, they have to comply with that rule. And then down in the lower left, we have our buyer requirements. So when you're going to sell produce to Whole Foods or Walmart or Kroger's, they're going to tell you you need to do these things in order to sell produce to us. So that is completely separate from the produce safety rule. Just please keep that in mind, because there's a big area of confusion that we deal with farmers. As part of those buyer requirements, a lot of times, you know, you have to do the third-party audit. And so those are your voluntary audits that, you know, where somebody comes out to your farm and they audit your food safety practices in order for you to be able to sell produce to your buyer. So try and give you guys a quick overview of that, but that's the differences between all of those things. And I can, if you have questions, I'm certainly happy to talk you through that in more detail. So what can you do now? So the best thing you can do is to have an on-farm readiness review. So these are the voluntary visits that CSU Extension does. So myself and another extension agent come out and we examine your practices and talk about how your practices fit into the produce safety rule. It's a great time for you to be able to ask questions about your practices, ask questions about the rule. And even if you don't have to comply with the rule, even if you're exempt, it can just be our farmers find that it's a really good evaluation for them and maybe seeing things with a third set of eyes that they weren't seeing previously. And so again, all size growers can request. So if you have to comply with the rule or if you don't, we've done visits for both types of farms. And again, farmers find it really valuable. So how are our visits going? So we've done 43 visits over the last 2 years. And what we found is that farmers are really doing most of the things on the farm right. Like they have a lot of good food safety practices that they're employing. And so we just need to refine those things a bit. So the areas where we found farmers need some extra help are around, again, worker training, helping make sure that they're covering all the points that they need to for, that food safety training, cleaning and sanitizing, food contact surfaces, and then pre-harvest assessments. Those are the general 3 areas where we typically see farmers need help. And interestingly enough, it is the same across the US. So, we get together and talk about how these visits are going in a general terms, not anybody's specific farm information, and these are generally the areas that everybody is seeing where farmers need some extra help. And so farmers, again, have really indicated that, this is really beneficial to them. It's worth their time to take the time to do this. And, they feel like we can provide a lot of really good resources that are tailored to your farm. So you don't have to go out and find all these things. After our visit, I send you the resources that are going to help you the most. And so if you're interested, a couple of things to keep in mind. Ideally, whoever's going to walk around the farm with us will have attended that grower training that I described earlier. Again, just the terminology and making sure that we're all on the same page. It's helpful. We've done some where farmers haven't attended, and it's really hard for the farmer to understand what it is we're trying to get at. We do need to do it when you're harvesting, and if possible, when you're packing. And again, it just helps us see those activities in action and allow us to evaluate those as they're happening. Again, we've done some where those activities weren't happening and the farmers felt like it wasn't as beneficial as if we would have been able to see those. The visits typically take about 4 hours. I know that seems like a long time. It goes really fast, but it just, farmers really feel like that time is worth it. It's worth it to just block out that time and be able to talk about the food safety practices. So if you're interested, again, reach out to me. I'm your main contact person for that, and I'm more than happy to get that scheduled for you. We only have this one webinar coming up, and for those of you that registered, I apologize. We had to postpone this webinar that we were going to have today at noon, where we talk about the gap audits in Colorado. We didn't have much participation, and so we felt like we're going to try and do it in the beginning of April, and we're going to shoot for like a 4 or 5 o'clock at night time to try and get maybe get some more farmers interested in participating in this. And so look for that date and that information to come out soon. That's all I have. Again, thank you so much for your time. Happy to take questions now. Here's my contact information if you think of something later. And then just a plug for our website. So we have a ton of resources on there, a ton of information to help you with your food safety practices and get this stuff done on your farm. So please go there for more resources. That's all I have.
So Christy, our first question is what's the cost of on-farm readiness review?
Oh, that's a great question. So they are free, completely free for the farmer. We get money from the Food and Drug Administration. So from FDA, it comes to CDA. And so we get a cooperative agreement with them. And all of that is included in all of the on-farm readiness reviews, and all of our work is included. Also, there is no charge for your produce safety inspection. If you get one of those from CDA, there's no charge for those or the registration. It's all, again, covered by that federal money.
And scheduling, I mean, you got to schedule it during the harvest. So I imagine you must be particularly busy at that time. Is that a difficulty?
It hasn't been. So, when we're coming out to the west, if I'm coming out to the west slope, I'll try and do 4 or 5 farms in one visit. So we'll do one in the morning, one in the afternoon, and try and get as many done as we can. It hasn't been a problem up to this point. They've been scattered enough that we've been able to accommodate Last summer it was really hard because we were on a stop work order. We couldn't go out and do any farm visits because of COVID until like after like middle of July. And so that really inhibited us from being able to do the visits. But other than that, it's generally, we're generally fine. We can scatter it out enough.
Would you mind putting your presentation back up again and going back to that one, or you can just show that one handout, that one pager handout with the 4 quadrants, if you wouldn't mind?
Yep.
Because we did have another question to ask, what's the cost of a full audit, which I'm assuming, of course, then is a third-party audit or a gap, audit,
Yeah.
which is the topic that will be covered in the rescheduled April gap audit webinar. So
yes, yeah. So that's a great question. It really varies with the size of the operation and what type of audit you're doing. So if you are doing the USDA gap audit through the Colorado Department of Agriculture, the general figure that they've given me in the past is like $1,200 to $1,500 for that visit. But if you do a different type, so if you are doing, so that's kind of like the main one that we see, but there are some retailers who require something called a Primus audit. And so that's a much more in-depth audit. And, it's scary to think about the costs associated with that. But I've had some farmers tell me that it's anywhere from $15,000 to $30,000 for them to do that type of an audit, which is just, it's insane to me. But so that's kind of the range. So we have this, less expensive range, with the gap audit, and then we have those more in-depth audits that are several $1,000s.
I want to inject in here too. Maybe there's more questions coming in that I'm not seeing, and if so, Barry, would you mind presenting those when I'm done here? But I was pleased to hear that the FDA put forth a rule that they later retracted and said that was too complicated. We got to study that some more, because I put forth a proposal that we should unpack all this in one of these online meetings, and then later retracted that because I found out how deep this rabbit hole goes. And so I asked Christy to pull this handout up because I really want to address that what we've tried to just focus on and cover here is kind of like, I would consider like the top half, the top 2 quadrants. And we're not really talking about the bottom 2 quadrants here right now. That's what that webinar that they'll reschedule for April will cover. And the reason we did that is just, I think that we need to establish a baseline here of what is federal and obligatory. And then out of that, what group of producers, are qualified to be exempt or modified exempt. And then even for those exemptions, what's the minimums, the standards? You do need to keep records. You do need to label correctly. And so those were the things that we basically covered. And I think that helps us to kind of start out and understand these are just kind of the bare minimum federal obligatory requirements. Now, next time we'll go into the third-party audits, buyer requirements, and such topics as those. And so the way we're going to tackle that is that I'm going to go ahead and promote this webinar that gets rescheduled for April. People can watch that. It's actually a part of our grant to go out and do interviews with producers and with the next party up that receive product from producers to understand what are those buyer requirements in produce safety rules, and what are the audits, and what's all the data that needs to be captured and recorded, and all the record keeping that happens in that phase. And so what we'll do is we'll schedule a time out into the future when we've done all that background homework with individuals, with interviews, and discovered what we needed to discover to work toward developing really the platform or the blockchain enabled digital information sharing and networking communication system. And then we'll come back and we'll report on that. And that might be probably off in the fall. But I think that's how I wanted to parse these 2 things out. Let's just deal with this here this morning. And so I hope that makes sense. But please, if anybody has any questions, let's go ahead and present those.
I have a question, and this might be going down a specific rabbit hole, but I wonder if there are specific considerations for, I don't know if you heard, Christy, my project update at the head of this meeting, but so we are in Gunnison a sustainable agriculture nonprofit organization, and we're putting together this aggregation distribution facility. So we're getting products from multiple farms, which I realize that doesn't make us covered under this act, but we also are a farm, and some of the products that we sell do come from our own farm. So if our sales of our own product are under the threshold, but we're selling over the threshold in dollars, but that's coming from other farms, are there considerations for our situation or documentation we would need to show that?
So, I'll ask you a couple questions. So for the produce that you are selling, do you buy that produce then, and then you're selling it under your farm, or is that sold under a different business name or partner or opportunity?
It's through our nonprofit organization. So we're Mountain Roots Food Project. We have our Mountain Roots Community Farm, but we also purchase products at wholesale rates from other farmers in our region, in our valley, and sell it through a distribution facility.
Okay, and is so Mountain Roots then, you own more than, so there's this thing called a secondary activities farm. So that's what I'm trying to identify if you guys are considered, if the part that's selling the produce is considered that. And so it sounds like it is, because it sounds like that's, you're buying it all in, and it's not like farmers don't have an ownership in each in that. Is that correct? It's Mountain Roots, but it's not like farmer partnerships or owning parts of it. Is that?
They don't own part of the business, if that's what you mean, but we list
Yeah.
it as, this product from Calder Farm and this product from Parker Pastures, and then it's all just purchasable, like a la carte items. So
Okay.
it's not listed like it's all from us, but the products that are from us are.
Okay, so yeah, so you would actually be considered a farm then under the definition, the way you've described your business. So for some co-ops, farmers own a part of, they would maintain ownership of their produce in the co-op. And so when that happens, then we have to get into, does Mountain Roots have more than 50%? Where does that division happen? And so it sounds like for you guys, that wouldn't apply to you. You would just be considered a farm under this rule, because you are purchasing that produce and then selling it under Mountain Roots. Even though you are giving credit to those farmers, you've still taken possession of that. And so that would be part of your food sales. So does that answer your question? So you would have, you would be part of the produce safety rule then. If you're under, you'd be over that 25,000, I'm guessing. So you might be eligible for that modified exemption, but you guys would be considered a farm.
Okay. Great. And even if that's kind of doubled up, like perhaps our producers are also covered, that,
Correct.
but we also need to be.
Yeah, and so that's a really key point. So if you are the way the rule is written right now, if you are bringing produce into your operation and selling it under your label or under your name, those farms that are supplying you have to be able to say that they're following the produce safety rule if they need to. So if they are a covered farm, they need to be complying with the produce safety rule in order for you to put it under your packaging or under your label. So if if you're an apple grower and you get apples from a whole bunch of other farmers and you put them out underneath your particular name, the farms that have to comply with the rule, they have to be, you have to keep track of that as well. And it's a really complicated thing, and I know it is. And so I apologize for going into that detail here now, but it is that is part of the requirement, because the way that the rule is written, it says that any produce that is covered under the produce safety rule needs to be separate from any produce that's not covered under the produce safety rule. So that would apply to farmers supplying you, but also to if you grow potatoes and cucumbers, you need to either grow them both to the produce safety rule standards, or you need to have completely separate equipment and anything that's contacting those commodities under the rule.
Thank you.
And I will just say too, Molly, you know Beth Lachelle, so we've been working pretty hard. I'm sure you know Beth Lachelle. So we've been working to create some resources for aggregators specifically because they're not covered under the produce safety rule. And so we put some resources together last year, and I'm trying to revive our group to finalize those. But basically, we put together kind of like a checklist for you guys that if you have farms that don't follow a third-party audit or don't have to comply with the produce safety rule, you could give them this resource that says, these are the things that you should be focused on, or what are you doing? And then they can fill that out and give it back. You guys can have a conversation around their practices. And again, we're just trying to help fill that void right now because there really isn't anything for aggregators under the produce safety rule. So it's just basically basic food safety practices that we put together in this document. And so I'll put you down on the list to send that to you, that it might be helpful for you to see that. Any other questions?
Harold, did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question going back to the cost. So if you're doing a gap certification audit and you've got that $1,200 to $1,500, does that include? I understand that there's an hourly fee that the inspectors charge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct. So that would be that $1,200 to $1,500 would be all of that. That's kind of just the average they've given me. It's definitely not a set in stone figure, but that would include the hourly, the travel time, all of the costs associated with them submitting it to USDA, and all of that. That $1,200 to $1,500 would include that. I will say that a couple things that it'll be a spoiler for the webinar that we do, but our gap auditors, they really do try and keep those costs down for farmers. So if they're located down in Monte Vista, and so when they come to the West Slope, they will try and do a bunch of audits in that area so they can spread out the travel costs amongst all the farmers. And so you're not having to pay for all their travel up and back, and then somebody else has to pay for all their travel up and back. So they do try and work really hard to keep those costs down for you guys. And they do have some cost share programs available too. They get some like a small grant from the Colorado Department of Agriculture, where they do a cost share with farmers. So for new farmers, they will pay up to 50% of your audit if you're new to the auditing, to the USDA gap audit. And then for existing farmers, they'll pay a portion of your audit. And so you just have to fill out their application and submit it to them, and then they will help get you that reduced rate.
Christy, we had a request. Sorry, Carol, if you have more, go ahead.
No, that's just the cost share program is under USDA.
It's under the Colorado Department of Agriculture. And I can have Sean send you guys the contact for our gap audits and the person who you'd be able to talk to about that cost share program.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
We did have one question in the chat, or a request to please explain again the 28,000 and the 500,000 thresholds for exemption.
Okay, sure. So for a farm to need to comply with the produce safety rule in any way, they have to sell over $28,075 in total produce sales. So that's to determine if you have to comply with the rule in any way. So that's the first part of it. And then the second part refers to a partial exemption from the produce safety rule. So if you're over that 28,000, now you have to comply with the rule, but you may be eligible for this partial exemption. And so that was where the 561,494 came from. So that's for total food sales, and that's to be eligible for that modified exemption, where you would just need to do record keeping and you would need to do the labeling. Did that answer the question for the person who submitted it, or is there something specific you wanted to ask about those?
Yeah, if so, please unmute and go ahead and ask. In the meantime, I have a short question. Is everything you talked about, like training, templates, audits, everything, the on-the-farm readiness review, Is it all available in Spanish?
So I'm not sure about the gap audit. I can check on that for you guys. For our resources, if we're trying to get things translated as farmers indicate that they need it. We haven't done a Spanish on-farm readiness review. We certainly could if somebody needed it. I work closely with a translator who could come out to the farm and do that. The produce safety rule itself has been translated into Spanish. So if you are interested in that or I can send you a rule book. And then also the grower training that we do, they have some Spanish trainers that can do that. And there's actually one of those coming up at the end of April that's going to be in Spanish. So if somebody needs that, please just shoot me an email and I can send you that information. Again, we've tried to do some of those grower trainings in Spanish where we do like a simultaneous translation, and we have not gotten any registrants at all. We just haven't, and so we feel like it's an area where we need, but we can't figure out like how to get those farmers who need that to sign up for that. So if anybody has any suggestions or ideas on how to reach that community, I would love to have a conversation with you, because like I said, we have tried and we aren't having those farmers who need that.
Well, that kind of relates to the next question I have, which is to do with enforcement. Like, ultimately, this is enforced by the FDA, but as I understand it, kind of through the Colorado Department of Agriculture. Would that be correct?
Kind of. Go ahead.
Well, just hold that question there. And then the other question is, what would you say to a producer who's like just thinking, you know what, I'm not going to comply and I'm not going to report, and until somebody shows up on my farm and tells me, hey, you're doing something wrong, I'm not doing anything. What would you say to that?
So the first part I would say I'll talk about first. So it is a federal law, but because the Colorado Department of Agriculture adopted it into state statute, they have the regulatory authority to, do the inspections, to do any enforcement actions that may need to be taken for whatever reason. But it is through the Colorado Department of Agriculture. So here in our state, FDA doesn't have jurisdiction to do any produce safety inspections or to do any enforcement activities related to an inspection or to the rule. If there's an outbreak situation, that's a little different. If we have a farm that ends up being implicated in an outbreak, then FDA would come in, but they will work alongside the Colorado Department of Agriculture and help resolve that outbreak. So again, FDA doesn't really have jurisdiction here because we did adopt that into the state statute. And then the second part of your question, I know there's farms that are just going to try and fly under the radar. I would say that, while that may seem like a good thing to do, I guess I go back to, if you do have an outbreak associated with your farm, you're going to be in a lot more trouble than if you hadn't identified yourself. And also, I really feel like, the produce safety rule is doable for farmers. That's my whole job with going out and doing these farm visits, is helping them see that they can accomplish this on their farm, and they're generally doing the things they need to do. There may be a couple extra records they need to keep or some documentation, but for the most part, farmers are doing what they need to do. And so, I guess that's generally my answer to farmers. But I know it's going to happen, and I know some farmers are going to just, not identify themselves, and I'm sad for them. They're missing out on a lot of opportunity to help keep them in business, because again, if one of our farmers has an outbreak, they're likely not going to survive it. I mean, we've seen it time and time again. They're going to go out of business, and then not only them, but then their neighbors and all the other farmers are going to be impacted as well, because people are just going to say, well, I'm not going to say it was just that farm. It's all Colorado produce that may be affected. And so it's a larger issue than just your specific farm.
Thanks for that. We're near the end of our time. I want to acknowledge that there are a few people on the call who are, producers who are GAP certified, that do third-party audits. There's somebody on the call too that also provides, a group GAP offering. And I want to reiterate that our intent and our plan is to meet with them, to go through those processes. I feel like we're going to handle that kind of on the side, on the background as part of our grant scope of work, and then later bring that to the table to report on as we understand them a little bit more thoroughly. I hope that this was informative to everybody. I typically, our plan was to have these on the last Thursday of every month. We moved this one around to accommodate Christy's availability, and thank you, Christy, for being available. It was really informative. It was very, very helpful. Next month, we'll have Kate Clark at Western Colorado University. She'll be presenting on their new intersectional environmental studies program that's going to include an emphasis on food security, climate action planning, and water studies. In May, fingers crossed, I'm hoping we might have a little bit more news on an aggregation and processing facility that could be a big, huge benefit to our regional food system. And that's it for now. So I just want to thank you all for joining us, and I'll provide a recording of this later, and look for our April newsletter in the first week of April. Thanks again. Thank you, Christy.
Thanks everybody for having me.